Hello everyone, my name is Maria Shadeen and I'll be discussing Chapter 12, More on Risk, Estimating the Potential for Prevention from our text. To begin, I just wanted to go over the objectives for this chapter. So there are three. The first is to calculate and interpret the attributable risk for the exposed group. The second is to calculate and interpret the population attributable risk. And the third is to describe how attributable risk is used to estimate the potential for prevention. So what is attributable risk? Attributable risk is the amount or proportion of disease incidence, also known as the disease risk, that can be attributed to a specific exposure. A great question that can be answered by this is how much of the disease that occurs can be attributed to a certain exposure. The book used the example of smoking and lung cancer. So it's saying if this person smokes, how likely are they to get the disease of question, which would be lung cancer, as opposed to somebody in the non-smoking group or the people without the exposure. This can also be done with coronary heart disease. If we look at people's diets, it's just saying that the person has this exposure or risk factor, and so how likely are they, compared to everybody else who does not have the exposure, to get the disease in question or outcome. So we can calculate the attributable risk for both the exposed, which is the risk of outcome in people with the exposure, such as the smokers or people with coronary heart disease, or we can calculate the total population's attributable risk, which includes both exposed and non-exposed. A good way to think of this is you're looking at the exposed person, but moreover, exactly how many of those exposed have the outcome in question or will get the outcome due to the exposure. Before moving on, I did want to go over what the difference between attributable risk and relative risk is, because this is really important and it was spoken about a lot in the chapter. So, relative risk is a measure of the strength of association and the possibility of a causal relationship, and this was also discussed in Chapter 11. And relative risk helps us make causal inferences, which will be discussed later in Chapter 14, as well as etiologic relationships. So, the difference is the attributable risk is in many ways more important in clinical and public health because it addresses this question. How much of the risk or incidence of a disease can we hope to prevent if we are able to eliminate exposure in the agent in question? Meaning, if we can prevent the exposure, how much would this lower the incidence rate? Again, think about smoking and lung cancer. So if we could stop everyone from smoking, how much would that lower the incidence rate? This is where attributable risks comes in. In understanding attributable risk, we also need to understand what is background risk. And background risk can be shown by this chart here. So we have our exposed on the left and our non-exposed on the right, and their levels of risk. So the background risk is in the light blue, and this is the portion of the non-exposed who still are at risk for getting the outcome. And so then the dark blue above that is the actual risk for the exposed. Both exposed and non-exposed persons have some type of background risk. Therefore, the total risk of disease in exposed individuals is the sum of the background risk that any person has and the additional risk due to the exposure in question. I like to think of this in terms of our modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors, especially in relation to the non-exposed group, because they could have non-modifiable risk factors such as genetic factors and other environmental factors that they're unable to control. These factors all contribute to a person's level of risk. Now that we understand background risk, I wanted to discuss how to calculate the total risk in the exposed group due to exposure. So the question asked here is, how much of the total risk of disease is due to the exposure? And the same will go back to lung cancer and smoking. So how much of the total risk of lung cancer would be due to smoking? The following formula can be used to calculate this. We use our incidence in the exposed group, which is the people at risk by exposure, subtracted by the incidence in the non-exposed group, or our background risk. As discussed previously, the unexposed are not exposed, but they still have some risk of disease. The book states that every person shares the same background risk regardless of whether he or she has had the specific exposure in question or not. Next, I want to go over how to calculate the proportion of risk in exposed persons due to the exposure. This would be our additional risk, or the dark blue portion in the past graph. The question being asked here is what proportion of exposed persons are at risk due to the exposure. This can be calculated by taking the in the exposed group and multiplying it by the incidence in the non-exposed group. We can also calculate the proportion by dividing the total risk in the exposed group that we discussed by the incidence in the exposed group. And so this is seen in the equation I have on the screen. On this slide, we will discuss the potential for prevention, which can be estimated by using attributable risk. On this slide, we see a clinician speaking with her patient. To put this into perspective, the clinician may be discussing with the patient about how changing their lifestyle habits might help them to avoid an unwanted outcome in the future. Because of attributable risk, the clinician can estimate in good faith that the individual's risk will be reduced by a certain proportion if he or she stops being exposed. For example, if this patient smokes cigarettes and is worried about developing lung cancer in the future, the clinician's able to tell them, if you cut back on smoking by this percent, your risk will drop for developing lung cancer in the future. In turn, attributable risk tells us the potential for prevention. However, we have to remember that multiple risk factors affect attributable risk. And if all incidents of a disease were the result of a single factor, then that attributable risk for the disease would be 100%. That risk is absolutely the cause of that disease, but in most cases, that is not the case. There are many different factors that can go into what causes an unwanted outcome to occur. These can include diet, weight, cholesterol, whether you're considered healthy, unhealthy, your family history, genetics. There's so many things that go into discussing the factors that relate to outcomes that we have to look at all of these in order to say that this is what's causing the disease in question. Going back to background risk, this is what we discuss here, is that even in the non-exposed group, so for lung cancer, even if you don't smoke cigarettes, there may be other exposures in your life that are putting you at risk for developing the disease. On this slide, we'll look at attributable risk for the total population, or the population attributable risk, also known as PAR. So we see here that there's a spectrum for potential effect. And on one end, all people are exposed, and on the other end, no one is exposed. Generally, in a population, people will fall within the arrow to where there are some who are exposed and some who are not exposed. Therefore, we have to keep in mind that the unexposed will not benefit from programs to reduce exposure regardless of how effective the program is, meaning there will always be a portion who are still at risk for the disease or outcome in question, even if there's a great intervention put in place, because it may not be due to that specific exposure that they get the disease in question. In order to find the effect of a program and what it would have on the specific population being analyzed, we will need to calculate the attributable risk for the total population. And this will answer questions such as, what proportion of the disease incidence in a total population can be attributed to a specific exposure, as well as what would be the total impact of a prevention program on the community. So, in order to calculate the attributable risk due to the total population due to the exposure, we'll use the same formula as discussed previously: incidence in the total population minus incidence in the non-exposed group. And then again, in order to express this as a proportion, we would do incidence in total population subtracted by incidence in the non-exposed group, divided by the incidence in the total population. This can answer questions such as, what proportion of the disease in the total population can be attributed to the risk factor, or if the exposure were eliminated, what proportion of the incidence of the outcome in the total population would be able to be prevented. This is an important concept in the field of public health because our main focus is preventing the outcome before it occurs. Therefore, we can focus on risk factors that are putting people most at risk for the outcome in question and create programs and interventions which focus on these specific groups and risk factors. So how do we calculate and interpret the attributable risk for the exposed group? We can do this by using previous formulas, including 12.1 and 12.2. And so in order to get the proportion, we would do incidence in the exposed group subtracted from incidence in the non-exposed group divided by the incidence in the exposed group. And so in order to interpret this, we would interpret it as this proportion, so this percent, so maybe 30% of the incident cases, the person who got the outcome, is attributable to the fact that they have the exposure, which may be smoking or some other type of lifestyle factor. Or this proportion would be defined as the proportion that if we had an effective program, we could hope to prevent this percent of incident cases of the disease that the exposed group has. So not to say we'd be able to prevent all of them due to other background risk. However, we would be able to do it due to the additional risk, which would be your smoking or contributing factors that we are looking at. Next, we're going to look at how to calculate and interpret the population attributable risk. So in order to do this, the book states that we either must know the incidence of the disease in the total population, which often we won't know, or we need to know the following three values, which is the incidence among the exposed, the incidence among the unexposed, and the proportion of the total population that smokes. So the formula for incidence in the total population would be the incidence in the exposed times the percent exposed in the population added to the incidence in the exposed times the percent unexposed in the population. So what does this tell us? This tells us how much of the total risk of disease in the population, both exposed and non-exposed persons, is attributed to the exposure in question. This would also tell us, if we had an effective prevention program, how much of a reduction in the disease incidence we could anticipate in the total population of both exposed and unexposed. Just to recap, attributable risk is an important public health and clinical concept. It explains how much of a disease can be prevented if we have an effective means of eliminating the exposure in question. Attributable risk, along with relative risk, as discussed in Chapter 11, are essential for understanding causation and the potential for prevention.